Amelia's eyes snapped open as the piercing sunlight sliced through the blinds, sending her into a squinting daze. Her head throbbed, her mouth dry, and a wave of nausea churned in her stomach. She groaned softly, trying to piece together where she was. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh linen filled her nose, and that was the first clue something was terribly wrong. This wasn't her room. Her pulse quickened as she sat up, clutching the silky sheets to her chest, her mind racing through fragments of the previous night. The room screamed luxury. High ceilings, minimalist decor, and a cityscape view framed by massive windows. Her heart skipped a beat when her eyes landed on the suit jacket draped carelessly over a nearby chair. It wasn't hers. Slowly, she turned her head, and there he was, a man half covered by the sheets, lying on his stomach, his toned back on full display, the breath hitched in her throat. Her brain scrambled for answers. What had she done? The memories were hazy but persistent. Sophie dragging her to that club, loud music pounding in her chest, and the man with the piercing blue eyes and confident smile who had bought her a drink. The way his hand had rested lightly on her lower back as he leaned in to talk over the music. She remembered laughing, feeling the electric buzz of his presence and the growing blur of alcohol clouding her judgment. Then, nothing. Just flashes. Dancing too close. Kissing. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her voice trembling. She stared at the man, her heart pounding wildly. He was gorgeous. Dark hair tousled perfectly, angular jawline, and a physique that belonged on the cover of a magazine. But this wasn't the time to admire him. She needed to leave. Quietly, she slid out of bed, flinching at the sharp pain between her legs that brought the weight of her mistake crashing down on her. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she began gathering her clothes scattered across the floor. A dress, one heel under the bed, the other by the door. Her hands shook as she tried to slip back into her outfit from the night before, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. How could I have been so reckless? She berated herself, biting her lip to keep the rising panic at bay. Sophie would never let her live this down if she found out. Amelia froze when the man stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent in his sleep. She held her breath, waiting for him to settle before resuming her frantic escape. She tiptoed toward the door, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it would wake him. She reached for the handle, only to realize she didn't have her phone. Spinning around, she scanned the room, spotting the small device on the nightstand next to him. Of course, she thought bitterly, because nothing about this morning could possibly go smoothly. Creeping back toward the bed, she carefully leaned over him to retrieve the phone, her breath hitching when she saw his face up close. He looked even better in the daylight. Perfectly sculpted features that seemed almost unreal. But this wasn't the time to admire him. She snatched the phone and darted back to the door, her chest tightening as she twisted the handle. Freedom! The hallway was equally luxurious, lined with expensive artwork and polished hardwood floors that seemed to echo every step she took. Amelia tried to walk as quietly as possible, wincing with every creak and clink of her heels. She couldn't believe she'd done something so reckless. This wasn't her. She was careful, responsible, not the kind of woman who woke up in a stranger's bed without a clue of how she got there. As she reached the elevator, she realized another problem. She didn't even know where she was. Pulling out her phone, she checked the time, 6:43 a.m., and winced. There was a slew of texts from Sophie, ranging from "Where are you?" to "Call me I seeking out." Amelia sighed and typed back a quick, vague response. "I'm fine. We'll explain later." The elevator dinged softly, and she stepped inside, her reflection in the mirrored walls making her cringe. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a tangled mess, and the strap of her dress refused to stay up. She looked like every cliche walk of shame story she'd ever heard. "This is not my life," she thought bitterly, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. The ride down felt excruciatingly long, her anxiety clawing at her chest as she imagined the man waking up to find her gone. What if he tried to track her down? What if he tried to track her down? What if he tried to track her down? Her face burned at the thought. She didn't even know his name. How had she let herself spiral so completely out of control? When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by a sleek lobby with marble floors and a concierge desk. Amelia kept her head down, praying no one would notice her as she hurried outside. The early morning air hit her like a slap, cool and bracing against her flushed skin. She pulled out her phone again to call a rideshare, her fingers fumbling as she tried to enter her location. A surge of relief washed over her when the car arrived and she slid into the back seat without a word. As the driver pulled away, she leaned back and let out a shaky breath, her mind racing through the events of the night. She tried to piece together every detail, every moment leading up to her decision to go home with him. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory was fragmented, like a broken mirror, reflecting only shards of the truth. Her phone buzzed in her lap, and she glanced down to see another text from Sophie. "Are you with that guy from the club? Who even was he?" Amelia groaned, tossing the phone aside. She didn't have answers for Sophie. Hell, she didn't have answers for herself. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression neutral but curious. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone light. Amelia stiffened, offering a tight smile. "You could say that." When she finally reached her apartment, she practically sprinted inside, locking the door behind her as if she could keep the memories out. She kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of shame and regret, mingled with a strange, unwelcome pang of longing. Shaking her head, she stood and headed for the shower, desperate to wash away the remnants of the night. As the hot water cascaded over her, she tried to convince herself it didn't matter. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. She'd never see him again. It was over. But deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she wasn't prepared for. What she didn't know was that the man she'd left behind would soon reappear in her life, not as a stranger, but as someone she couldn't escape, her new boss. Amelia adjusted the hem of her blazer for the fifth time that morning, staring at her reflection in the gleaming elevator doors. She was trying to psych herself up, but her nerves were on edge. It was her first day at her new job, a personal assistant position at Anderson Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Landing the job had felt like a dream come true, a chance to turn her life around after years of struggle. But now Standing in the lobby of the towering glass building, her stomach churned with anticipation. The elevator dinged, and Amelia stepped inside, clutching her bag tightly. She took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing her introduction to her new boss, the CEO's son, Ethan Anderson. She'd heard he was demanding, but brilliant. The kind of leader who didn't tolerate mistakes. She was determined to make a good impression and prove she was capable of handling the challenges ahead. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the 34th floor, spacious, modern, and intimidatingly sleek. Amelia stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. A woman at the reception desk greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Amelia Carter. Mr. Anderson is expecting you. His office is down the hall, last door on the left," she said. Amelia nodded, offering a polite smile in return. "Thank you." Her palms were sweating as she walked down the corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She paused outside the door, smoothing her hair one last time before knocking softly. "Come in," a deep voice called from inside. She pushed the door open and stepped into the office. Her heart skipped a beat as she took in the room. Floor to ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the city, sleek furniture, and a massive desk at the center. But it wasn't the office that caught her attention. It was the man standing behind the desk. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Ethan Anderson, the man from the club, the man she had woken up next to just days ago. For a moment, Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. How was this possible? She'd left that night thinking she'd never see him again, and now he was standing right in front of her, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his piercing blue eyes scanning her with a faint air of curiosity. "Miss Carter, I presume," Ethan said, his voice smooth and commanding. Amelia forced herself to nod, her throat dry. "Yes, that's me, Amelia Carter." He stepped around the desk, extending a hand toward her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking it, praying he wouldn't notice the tremor in her grip. His touch was firm, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to Anderson Enterprises. I trust you'll find everything you need to get started," Ethan said, releasing her hand and gesturing toward a chair. "Please, have a seat." Amelia sat down, her mind still spinning. He didn't recognize her. Relief mingled with confusion as she realized he had no idea who she was or what had happened between them. To him, she was just another employee, a stranger. "Let me make one thing clear, Miss Carter," Ethan continued, his tone professional but firm. "I expect excellence. This is a high-pressure environment, and I don't have time for mistakes. Can you handle that?" Amelia straightened her posture, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Anderson. I understand." "Good." He walked back to his desk, picking up a folder and handing it to her. "This contains your tasks for the week. Familiarize yourself with it and report to me if you have any questions. My schedule is demanding, so I need someone who can keep up. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Amelia replied, clutching the folder like a lifeline. Ethan studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to assess every detail. "You look familiar," he said suddenly, his brow furrowing slightly. "Have we met before?" Amelia's heart lurched, panic flaring in her chest. She forced a polite smile, shaking her head. "I don't think so, sir. This is my first time working in the city." He nodded slowly, though the faint crease in his brow remained. "Very well. You're dismissed." Amelia stood, clutching the folder tightly as she made her way to the door. She could feel his eyes on her back, and it took every ounce of willpower not to turn around. Once she was safely outside the office, she exhaled shakily, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. How could this be happening? Of all the people in the world, why did her new boss have to be him? She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. She needed to focus. Ethan didn't remember her, and she intended to keep it that way. As long as she maintained her professionalism, she could get through this. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions, meetings, and paperwork. Amelia threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the lingering tension that coiled in her chest. But every time she saw Ethan, whether passing him in the hallway or sitting across from him in a meeting, she felt a jolt of nerves, a reminder of the secret she was desperately trying to bury. By lunchtime, her exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. She made her way to the break room, grateful for a moment of quiet. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Sophie's voice echoed in her head. "Are you with that guy from the club? Who even was he?" Amelia shook her head, trying to push the memory aside. She couldn't afford to think about that night. Not here, not now. The door to the break room swung open, and Amelia's stomach dropped as Ethan walked in. He didn't seem to notice her at first, heading straight for the coffee machine. She froze, unsure whether to acknowledge him or make a quick exit. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice startling her. "How are you finding your first day?" She turned to face him, her pulse quickening. "It's been good, sir. A bit overwhelming, but I'm managing." He nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Good. I like my team to be adaptable." Amelia forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see through her facade. She was about to excuse herself when he spoke again. "You said you've never worked in the city before," Ethan said, his tone casual but curious. "Where are you from?" "Small town, upstate," she replied, keeping her answer vague. "I moved here recently for better opportunities." "Ambitious. I can respect that," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "This company demands a lot, but if you can keep up, it'll be worth it." "I'll do my best," Amelia said, clutching her cup like it was a shield. Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering in a way that made her stomach twist. She couldn't tell if he was trying to place her or if she was just imagining things. Either way, the tension was unbearable. "Well, I won't keep you," he said finally, turning toward the door. "Get some rest. The real work starts tomorrow." Amelia nodded, watching him leave before collapsing into a chair. Her heart was racing, her thoughts spinning. This was going to be harder than she'd anticipated. She had managed to escape once, but now she was trapped in his world, with no way out. Amelia tried to steady her breathing as she sat at her desk, typing out Ethan's schedule for the week. It had been 3 days since her first encounter with him in the office, and the tension in her chest had only grown. Every time he walked into the room, she could feel the air shift, his presence commanding attention without him saying a word. She had done everything possible to stay professional, avoiding direct eye contact and keeping their conversations strictly about work. but deep down, she knew she was unraveling. It wasn't just his physical presence, though that alone was enough to leave her flustered. It was the way he carried himself, the effortless confidence, the sharp intellect, and worse, the way her body betrayed her every time their hands brushed, when exchanging papers or when his voice dropped just slightly as he gave instructions. She hated herself for it. He was her boss, and she had no business feeling this way, especially not after their one night mistake. Sophie's call the night before had only added to her stress. So, Sophie had teased, how's the job going? Any chance you've run into Mr. Handsome again? Amelia froze, her grip tightening on her phone. Sophie, you need to stop bringing him up. What? I'm just saying, a guy like that, he's hard to forget. Amelia closed her eyes, frustration bubbling. Drop it, okay? He's ancient history. Sophie's laugh rang through the line. Fine, fine. But don't come crying to me when he shows up again. You were practically drooling over him. The irony of Sophie's words wasn't lost on her. Amelia couldn't bring herself to tell her best friend the truth. How could she? That ancient history was now her boss, and every day felt like walking a tightrope over disaster. As the morning progressed, Amelia tried to focus on the endless stream of tasks Ethan had assigned her. Filing reports, arranging meetings, following up with clients. It was enough to keep her busy, but not enough to silence the nagging voice in her head. He hadn't recognized her right. There was no way he could know. But why did he keep looking at her like that, as if he was trying to piece together a puzzle? The tension came to a head during a late morning meeting. Amelia was seated at the conference table, her notepad balanced on her lap, as Ethan led the discussion with several department heads. She took notes diligently, her head down, determined not to draw attention to herself. But then Ethan said her name. Miss Carter, he said, his tone even but firm. Do you have the quarterly performance projections I asked for? Amelia's head shot up, her cheeks flushing. Yes, sir. One moment. She fumbled with her folder, her hands trembling as she pulled out the document. She rose to hand it to him, but her heel caught on the chair leg. With a yelp, she stumbled forward, the paper slipping from her grasp and scattering across the table. A beat of silence followed, the tension in the room palpable. Amelia's face burned as she scrambled to pick up the papers, muttering apologies under her breath. Ethan crouched down beside her, gathering a few pages and handing them to her. Their fingers brushed, and she felt a spark that made her pull back quickly. Take a breath, Miss Carter, he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't comforting either. It was controlled, like he was holding something back. Thank you, sir, she mumbled, returning to her seat as quickly as possible. The meeting continued, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary. By the time lunch rolled around, Amelia's nerves were shot. She sat in the break room, picking at a salad she had no appetite for, when Sophie's name flashed on her phone. Against her better judgment, she answered. How's work, superstar? Sophie chirped. Still keeping your mystery man in your thoughts? Amelia groaned. Sophie, I swear. I'm kidding. Mostly. But seriously, you sound stressed. Is your boss a tyrant or something? Amelia hesitated, chewing on her lip. He's intense, perfectionist, demanding. So, a nightmare. No, not exactly. Amelia sighed. It's just complicated. Complicated how? Sophie pressed. Amelia, you're not crushing on him, are you? Her silence must have given her away because Sophie gasped dramatically. You are. Oh my God, tell me everything. There's nothing to tell, Amelia said quickly, her voice dropping to a whisper. And keep your voice down. Relax, I'm not there, Sophie said, laughing. But come on, you can't just drop a bomb like that and not spill. Amelia lowered her phone, glancing around the break room. It was empty, but she still felt exposed. Sophie, I can't talk about this. It's personal. Oh, personal! Now you have to tell me. Before Amelia could respond, the door to the break room opened, and her heart nearly stopped. Ethan walked in, his gaze landing on her almost instantly. He was holding his phone to his ear, his expression serious, but his eyes seemed to flicker with recognition as they met hers. I'll call you later. Amelia whispered into the phone, ending the call and slipping it into her bag. She turned her attention back to her untouched salad, hoping Ethan wouldn't say anything. Miss Carter, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet room. I need the client reports on my desk by 2 p.m. Yes, sir, she replied, keeping her tone neutral. He nodded and left without another word, but the moment lingered. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that he had overheard more of her conversation than he let on. The afternoon passed in a blur of work, but Amelia's thoughts were a whirlwind. Why did Ethan keep looking at her like that? Did he suspect something? She couldn't let herself spiral into paranoia, but every interaction with him felt charged, as if there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. That evening, as Amelia packed up her things to leave, she heard footsteps approaching her desk. She looked up to see Ethan standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Miss Carter, he said, his tone softer than usual. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't mean to put you on the spot in the meeting. Amelia blinked, surprised by the unexpected gesture. Oh, thank you, sir. It's fine, really. He studied her for a moment, his gaze searching. You seem distracted lately. Is everything all right? Her stomach twisted. Yes, sir. Everything's fine. He nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Very well. Have a good evening. You too, sir, Amelia said, watching him walk away. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweaty. She needed to get a grip. Whatever Ethan suspected, she couldn't let him find out the truth. As she stepped into the elevator, Amelia leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The tension was suffocating, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. But for now, all she could do was brace herself for what was to come. Amelia sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the small plastic stick in her trembling hands. The two bold pink lines were impossible to ignore, no matter how many times she blinked or tried to convince herself otherwise. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the realization hit her like a freight train. She, was pregnant. The weight of the revelation made her feel like the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. Her fingers tightened around the test as if crushing it could somehow erase what it meant. But there was no denying the truth staring back at her. This wasn't just a scare. This was real. And there was only one possible father. Ethan. A wave of nausea swept over her, and she wasn't sure if it was from the pregnancy or the sheer panic gripping her chest. She stumbled to the bathroom, leaning over the sink and splashing cold water on her face. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, wide-eyed, and trembling. How could this have happened? She had been so careful her whole life, always avoiding risks, making plans, staying responsible. Yet one night, one reckless decision had changed everything, and now she had to figure out what to do. Her mind raced with questions. Should she tell Ethan? Could she even face him? He didn't remember her, didn't know what had happened that night. To him, she was just an employee. What would he think if she told him the truth? Would he believe her? Would he think she was lying to trap him? Amelia sank to the bathroom floor, hugging her knees to her chest as tears spilled down her cheeks. She felt completely alone, suffocated by the weight of her secret. She couldn't tell Sophie. Not yet, anyway. Sophie would demand she tell Ethan, and Amelia wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not when she barely understood how she felt about it herself. The next morning, Amelia dragged herself to work, every step feeling heavier than the last. The office seemed brighter, louder, more suffocating than usual. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with her co-workers as she made her way to her desk. The thought of seeing Ethan made her stomach churn, but she couldn't afford to slip up. Not now. Ethan was in his office when she arrived, his deep voice carrying through the door as he spoke on the phone. Amelia hesitated outside, clutching a stack of reports she needed to deliver. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before knocking. "Come in," he called, his tone brisk. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, keeping her gaze on the papers in her hands. "Here are the reports you requested, Mr. Anderson." "Thank you, Miss Carter. Just leave them on the desk," he said, not looking up from his laptop. Amelia set the papers down and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Wait a moment." Her heart skipped a beat as she turned back around. Ethan had finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Prognition, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "You seem distracted." Amelia's throat tightened. She forced a polite smile. "I'm fine, sir. Just a little tired." Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. Let me know if you need anything." "Yes, sir," she said, quickly retreating to the safety of her desk. The rest of the day passed in a blur, her mind too clouded by anxiety to focus. She kept replaying the moment in Ethan's office, wondering if he suspected something. He couldn't, could he? No. There was no way. She had been careful not to give anything away, but the paranoia gnawed at her, making her jump every time someone spoke to her. That evening, as Amelia prepared to leave the office, Sophie called. She debated ignoring it, but guilt tugged at her, so she answered. "Hey, Amelia!" Sophie's voice was bright and cheerful. a stark contrast to Amelia's mood. How's everything going? Did you finally tell your boss you're secretly in love with him? Amelia groaned, pinching the bridge of her nose. Sophie, please, I'm not in the mood. What's wrong? Sophie's tone shifted, concern replacing her teasing. Amelia hesitated, the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell Sophie, to unload the burden weighing her down, but fear held her back. She couldn't bring herself to say it. Not yet. I'm just tired, she said weakly. It's been a long day. Sophie didn't sound convinced, but she let it go. All right, but you know I'm here if you need to talk, right? Yeah. Thanks, Soph. After hanging up, Amelia sat in her car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth. Sooner or later, she would have to face it. And sooner or later, Ethan would have to know. The next few days were a blur of nausea, sleepless nights, and mounting dread. Amelia avoided Ethan as much as possible, using every excuse she could think of to keep their interactions to a minimum. But avoiding him only made her more conspicuous. It all came to a head on Friday afternoon. Amelia was in the break room, sipping a cup of tea to settle her stomach, when Sophie called again. This time, Amelia answered out of sheer exhaustion. Sophie, I can't talk right now, she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. What's going on with you? Sophie demanded. You've been acting weird all week. Spill. Amelia's grip tightened on the phone. She couldn't keep this in any longer. The secret was eating her alive. Sophie, I think I'm pregnant, she admitted in a trembling voice. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then Sophie's voice came, sharp and urgent. What? Amelia, are you serious? How? I mean, I know how, but... Amelia cut her off, her voice barely above a whisper. It's him, Sophie. My boss, Ethan. Sophie let out a low whistle. Oh, Amelia, what are you going to do? I don't know, Amelia admitted, tears welling in her eyes. I'm terrified, Sophie. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he fires me? I can't. She stopped abruptly, realizing she wasn't alone. She turned slowly, her heart plummeting when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. How much had he heard? Miss Carter, he said evenly, his voice a shade too calm. I think we need to talk. Amelia's blood ran cold. Her secret was out, and there was no escaping it now. Ethan's words hung in the air like a blade suspended over her head. Amelia froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. He had heard her. There was no way he hadn't. The calmness in his voice, the steady, unreadable gaze, only made the moment more terrifying. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter behind her, desperate for stability. Miss Carter, Ethan said again, his tone sharper this time. My office. Now. Amelia's stomach twisted into knots. There was no escaping this. She nodded numbly, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. As she followed Ethan down the corridor, her vision blurred and her thoughts spiraled. How much did he know? What was he going to say? What could she possibly say? Ethan held the door open for her, gesturing for her to enter first. Once inside, she stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ethan shut the door behind him, the soft click echoing ominously. He walked to his desk, leaning against it, arms crossed. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and she felt like he could see right through her. "Amelia," he said, his voice low but firm, "is there something you'd like to tell me?" Her name on his lips made her stomach lurch. It was the first time he'd addressed her by her first name, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her brain scrambling for words. Every excuse, every deflection she'd considered over the past week now seemed laughable. There was no way out of this. I, her, her voice was barely a whisper. She looked down at her trembling hands, her breath catching. "Try the truth," Ethan said, his tone sharper now, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I overheard enough to know this isn't just a workplace issue. So I'll ask again. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Amelia's knees felt like they might give out. She forced herself to meet his gaze, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said finally, her voice breaking. "And you're the father." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's expression didn't change at first, but she could see the gears turning in his mind. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her words. For a moment, he said nothing, and the tension in the room became suffocating. "You're saying," he began, his voice controlled but laced with disbelief, "that this happened between us. When?" Amelia swallowed hard, her palms clammy. "The night we met at the club." Ethan straightened, pushing off the desk and taking a step closer to her. "The club," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You're telling me that night." He stopped abruptly, running a hand through his hair as realization dawned on his face. "That was you." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't even know your name until I started working here. And you didn't recognize me." Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. The weight of the revelation seemed to hit him all at once, and he turned away, pacing the room. His hands found his hips, his head bowed, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle that had been shattered. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice low, but filled with restrained anger. "From the moment you realized, you should have come to me. Instead, you, what? Pretended nothing happened." "I didn't know how to tell you," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "You're my boss, Ethan. I didn't want you to think I was. That I was trying to manipulate you or trap you." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through by keeping this from me? I've been trying to figure out why you seemed so familiar, why I couldn't shake this feeling that I knew you. And now you drop this on me?" "I'm sorry," Amelia said, her voice breaking. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Ethan's anger faltered for a moment, and his gaze softened just slightly. He took a deep breath, running a hand down his face. "Scared or not, you should have trusted me. This isn't just about you, Amelia. This isn't just about you, Amelia. This is about our child. The words hit her like a hammer. Our child. It was the first time he'd acknowledged it, and it sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. She sank into the chair behind her, burying her face in her hands. I know, she whispered. I know I should have told you. I just, I didn't know how to face you. Ethan crossed the room and crouched in front of her, his hands resting on his knees. Look at me, he said softly. Amelia lifted her head, her tear-streaked face meeting his steady gaze. His expression was calmer now, though his eyes still held a storm of emotions. I need you to understand something, he said. This isn't just your burden to carry. I have a right to know, a right to be involved, a right to be involved. You didn't give me that chance, and that's not fair. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice barely audible. I never wanted to shut you out. I didn't want to complicate your life. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Complicate my life. Amelia, you've turned my entire world upside down, but that doesn't mean I'm walking away. Her breath hitched. You're not? No, he said firmly. I'm not. I'm not that kind of man. If this is my child, then I'm going to step up. But I need you to trust me. No more secrets. No more avoidance. We handle this together. Amelia searched his face for any sign of hesitation, but all she saw was determination. A small part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself feel the relief she so desperately craved. But another part of her couldn't help wondering if this was all too good to be true. I don't want to be a burden to you, she said softly. You're not, Ethan said, his voice steady. This is my responsibility just as much as it is yours. And I'll be damned if I let you do this alone. Amelia felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the tiniest flicker of hope. Ethan's hand reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently resting on hers. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. We'll figure this out, he said, but I need you to meet me halfway. Can you do that? She nodded, her voice catching as she whispered, I'll try. Ethan offered a faint smile, standing and extending a hand to help her up. Amelia took it, feeling the warmth of his grip as he pulled her to her feet. For the first time in days, the crushing weight on her chest began to lift, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Amelia sat in her small apartment, the evening light filtering through the blinds and casting soft patterns on the walls. She held her phone tightly, staring at the last message Ethan had sent her earlier that day. We need to talk tonight. I'll come to you. Let me know when you're ready. The words were polite, yet there was an unmistakable weight behind them. Since their confrontation in his office, things had shifted between them. He'd been calmer, more deliberate in his actions, but she could still sense the undercurrent of emotions he hadn't fully expressed. There was a knock at the door, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she stood and walked to open it. Ethan stood on the other side, dressed casually in a button-down shirt and dark jeans, a sharp contrast to his usual commanding business attire. Yet even now, his presence seemed to fill the room the moment he stepped inside. Hi, Amelia said softly, closing the door behind him. Hi. Ethan replied, his voice steady but quiet. He glanced around the modest apartment, his eyes landing briefly on the cozy couch and the stack of paperwork on the kitchen table before returning to her. Thanks for letting me come over. She nodded, gesturing toward the couch. Do you want to sit? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then moved to sit down, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at her. Amelia sat across from him, feeling the tension between them like a taut string waiting to snap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I've been thinking, Ethan began, breaking the silence, about everything, about us, about us, about the baby, about what all of this means. Amelia's chest tightened, and I realized I've been going about this all wrong, he said, leaning back slightly and running a hand through his hair. I've been so focused on the shock of it all, on trying to make sense of what happened, that I didn't stop to think about how you must have felt. You've been carrying this alone for weeks, Amelia. That's not fair. She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd be angry or worse, that you wouldn't care. Ethan shook his head, his expression softening. I was angry, yes, but not because of the pregnancy. I was angry because I felt like I'd failed you somehow, like I should have remembered you, should have realized sooner. The truth is, I can't stop thinking about that night. It's been in the back of my mind ever since, even if I didn't understand why. Her breath caught, and she looked up at him, searching his face for any sign that he was just saying what he thought she wanted to hear. But his eyes held a sincerity that made her heart ache. I want to be part of this, Amelia, he continued. Not just for the baby, but for you. I want to support you, to figure out what this could mean for us. But I need to know if you'll let me. Amelia's throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. She had spent so long convincing herself that she had to face this alone, that Ethan wouldn't, or couldn't, be the person she needed him to be. But here he was, offering her something she hadn't dared to hope for. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been so scared, Ethan, of what people will think, of how this will change everything, of losing control over my life. Ethan leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We'll figure it out together, but you're not alone in this anymore. I promise you that. She wiped at her eyes, a small, tentative smile breaking through her tears. Thank you. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for what they could build together. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be okay. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Ethan insisted on accompanying her to her first prenatal appointment, an act that both comforted and terrified her. He was calm and composed as they sat in the waiting room, but she could see the flicker of nerves in the way his fingers tapped against his knee. When the doctor performed the ultrasound, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, steady and strong. Amelia glanced at Ethan, expecting him to look uncomfortable or detached. Instead, she saw something she hadn't anticipated. Awe. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his jaw slightly slack as he took in the tiny image of their child. "That's ours?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with wonder. Amelia nodded, her own heart swelling at the sight. "Yeah, that's ours." Ethan reached out, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. The gesture spoke volumes, and for the first time, Amelia felt like they were truly in this together. Outside of the doctor's appointments, Ethan made it clear that he was fully committed to being part of her life. He started checking in on her more frequently, bringing her meals when she was too tired to cook, and insisting she let him handle anything heavy or strenuous. At first, his overprotectiveness annoyed her, but she soon realized it was his way of showing he cared. One evening, he invited her to dinner at his penthouse. Amelia hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea to blur the lines between their personal and professional lives even further. But the earnestness in his invitation won her over. The penthouse was as immaculate as she remembered, though this time she wasn't sneaking out in a panic. The atmosphere felt warm and inviting, with soft music playing in the background and the scent of something delicious wafting from the kitchen. "I hope you like pasta," Ethan said, emerging from the kitchen with 2 plates of spaghetti carbonara. "You cook?" Amelia asked, raising an eyebrow as she sat at the dining table. "Don't sound so surprised," he replied with a smirk, setting the plates down. "I'm full of surprises." They ate together, the conversation flowing easily for the first time. They talked about everything: her childhood in a small town, his life growing up in a family of overachievers, their hopes and fears for the future. It was the most vulnerable either of them had been, and by the end of the night, Amelia felt like she was finally starting to understand him. As she got up to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. "Amelia," he said softly, "I know this isn't exactly how either of us planned things, but I want you to know that I care about you. And I'm not just saying that because of the baby." Her breath hitched, her eyes meeting his. "Ethan, I don't expect you to feel the same way," he continued, his voice steady but vulnerable. "But I need you to know that I'm here, for you, for us, whatever that means." Amelia felt her heart swell, the walls she had so carefully built around herself beginning to crumble. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Ethan, but I think I want to try." His expression softened, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "Then we'll take it one step at a time." As he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, Amelia closed her eyes, letting herself believe that redemption and love might just be possible after all. Amelia stood in front of the mirror, her hands smoothing over the soft fabric of her dress. It wasn't the elaborate wedding gown she dreamed of as a child, but it was perfect in its simplicity. A knee-length white dress that hugged her figure and accommodated the growing swell of her belly. Her fingers traced the curve absent-mindedly, her mind spinning with anticipation and nerves. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life unfolding, but somehow it felt right. A knock at the door startled her. She turned to see Sophie peeking her head in, her face lit up with excitement. "You ready?" Sophie asked, stepping inside. Amelia let out a shaky laugh. "As ready as I'll ever be." "You look beautiful," Sophie said, her voice softening as she approached. I mean it, Amelia. You're glowing. Amelia smiled, her fingers fiddling with the silver bracelet on her wrist. Thanks, Soph. I just, I can't believe this is happening. Everything feels so surreal. It's real, Sophie assured her, taking her hands. And you deserve this. Both of you do. Amelia took a deep breath, her nerves settling slightly under Sophie's comforting words. Okay, let's do this. The courthouse was small and unassuming, its simplicity a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions Amelia felt as she walked through the doors. Ethan was already there, standing near the judge's desk in a crisp navy suit that seemed to fit him like a second skin. He turned as she entered, his gaze softening the moment it landed on her. For a second, the world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them. You look stunning, he said, his voice low and full of warmth. Amelia felt her cheeks flush, but she managed a small smile. You clean up pretty well yourself. He extended a hand toward her, and she took it, feeling the strength and steadiness in his grip. It grounded her, reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. They were doing this together. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken by the judge formal yet heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Amelia found herself looking into Ethan's eyes, seeing a depth of emotion that left her breathless. His words were simple but sincere, a promise to stand by her side through every challenge and joy they would face together. When it was her turn, she spoke from the heart, her voice trembling but unwavering. I never thought my life would take me here, she said softly, her gaze locked on his. But I'm glad it did. I'm glad it brought me to you. When the judge finally pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan leaned in, his kiss gentle but full of unspoken promises. The room erupted in soft applause from Sophie and the few close friends they'd invited. But all Amelia could hear was the pounding of her heart and the whispered words Ethan spoke against her lips. I love you. The drive back to Ethan's penthouse was quiet, the air between them filled with a sense of calm that felt almost surreal. Amelia stared out the window, watching the city lights blur as they passed. Her hand rested on her stomach, a small smile tugging at her lips as she thought about their baby, their future. You're quiet, Ethan said, glancing at her from the driver's seat. Just thinking, she replied, turning to him, about how much has changed, about how much more is going to change. Ethan reached over, his hand finding hers. Change isn't always a bad thing. She squeezed his hand, a sense of peace settling over her. No, it's not. When they arrived at the penthouse, Amelia was greeted by a sight that made her heart swell. The living room had been transformed. Candles flickered on the coffee table, soft music played in the background, and a bouquet of her favorite flowers sat in a vase on the counter. Ethan had clearly planned this, and the thoughtfulness of it brought tears to her eyes. You didn't have to do all this, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to, Ethan replied, stepping closer to her. You deserve to feel special every day. Amelia blinked back tears as he guided her to the couch, where they sat together, her head resting on his shoulder. For a while, they simply sat in silence, content in each other's presence, content in each other's presence. As the weeks turned into months, Amelia and Ethan began to settle into their new lives together. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements, moments of doubt, and the occasional flare of tension as they navigated their unexpected journey. But through it all, they leaned on each other, finding strength in their growing bond. Ethan was relentless in his support, attending every doctor's appointment, reading every parenting book he could get his hands on, and even assembling the crib for the nursery himself. Amelia often caught him standing in the doorway of the room, his hand on the edge of the crib, a soft smile on his face as he imagined their baby sleeping there. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Ethan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about names. Amelia raised an eyebrow, amused. Oh, and what have you come up with? Well, he said, his lips quirking into a smile, if it's a boy, I was thinking something strong, like Caleb or Oliver. And if it's a girl? Amelia asked, tilting her head. Leela, he said softly, after my grandmother. She was one of the strongest women I've ever known. Amelia's heart ached at the tenderness in his voice. I love that. Ethan reached over, his hand covering hers. I just want them to have a name that means something, a name that reminds them they're loved and they're loved. They'll know, Amelia said, her voice filled with quiet confidence, because they'll have you. The day their baby arrived was a storm of chaos and emotion. Amelia had gone into labor in the early hours of the morning, and Ethan had driven to the hospital like a man possessed, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stayed by her side through every contraction, every agonizing moment, whispering words of encouragement and holding her hand as she brought their child into the world. When the baby's cries filled the room, Ethan's breath caught, his eyes wide with awe as he stared at the tiny, wriggling life in the doctor's hands. It's a girl, the doctor announced, placing the baby on Amelia's chest. Tears streamed down Amelia's face as she looked at her daughter for the first time. She was perfect, tiny fingers, a soft patch of dark hair, and the most delicate features she'd ever seen. Ethan leaned over, his own eyes glistening as he gently touched the baby's hand. Leela, he whispered, his voice breaking. Welcome to the world. Back at the penthouse, as Amelia rested in their bedroom, Ethan stood in the nursery, cradling Lila in his arms. He swayed gently, his voice low as he hummed a lullaby. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of fabric and the baby's steady breathing. Amelia watched from the doorway, her heart full as she took in the sight. This was her family, their family, their family. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had found, and it was beautiful. Ethan looked up, catching her gaze, and smiled. Come here, he said softly. She crossed the room, leaning against him as he held their daughter. Together, they stood in the soft glow of the nightlight, their hearts beating as one. And for the first time, Amelia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. It means the world to us that you took the time to listen and reflect. Life is unpredictable, as this story reminds us, but it's often in the unexpected moments that we find the greatest opportunities for growth, love, and connection. Amelia and Ethan's journey teaches us the importance of honesty, courage, and trust, not just in others but in ourselves. It's a powerful reminder that even when life takes an unexpected turn, it's how we choose to face it that defines us. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Did this story resonate with you, or do you have a similar experience to share? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. If you enjoyed this video and want more heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a single video that could brighten your day or inspire you to see life in a whole new way. Thank you for being here, and we can't wait to see you in the next one.